Hi, welcome to the next video. Today we are gonna analyze the different political regimes during the 17th century. As you may know from the last video, the two main political regimes that will appear here, well, one will appear and another will be maintained, and he will evolve naturally from the authoritarian and feudal systems, are the absolute monarchy and the parliamentary systems. Those parliamentary systems can be monarchies, like for example an absolute monarchy but with a parliament on the side to compensate the power of the king. Or they can be systems if they do not have a monarchy. They can be another systems like for example a republic, as it will happen with the Dutch Republic. So let's start with the absolute monarchies. We already learned a bit about those absolute monarchies. They are similar as the authoritarian and not quite as the feudal ones, but they will evolve from the feudal monarchies. They are the most common type. It means that the majority of states, of countries, they will follow this system, the absolute monarchic system. And as I said, they are a natural evolution from those previous monarchies, first feudal, then authoritarian, and finally absolute. The concept is more or less the same. It means that the king controls all the state power. So that's why we are gonna call them as absolute monarchies, because the power of the king is absolute. There's no other individual or no other institution that shares power with the king or even is competing with the king. In the feudal systems, the king had power, but the nobility was opposing his power, and he had to share power with the nobility. It was mandatory for him if he wanted to survive and be able to manage the kingdom. The first thing we are going to learn is those, or let's start defining those powers of the state. Those state powers can be comprised in those three major powers. So this triad is the source of power of any state: the legislative, executive, and judicial power. Alright? So the king in the absolute monarchies, he got those three. He had the power first to create, pass, or abolish laws. It means that if there's a law that the king doesn't like it anymore, he can abolish the law and then create a new one. Then he has the executive power. It means that he has major powers to apply those created laws. So first he created the law, and then he had the capability to apply those laws. Apart, the executive power means that he is the main manager of the kingdom, of the resources of the kingdom. So for example, he had the ability to levy taxes, to create armies, to act about diplomacy, to enforce order through the militias and the police. So his power was huge, creating laws and then applying them. Finally, last but not least, the judicial power. The source of the judicial power is the king. Obviously, he by himself he then enforce justice, but he will cede the power to other individuals, to the judges, and the judges will enforce justice in his name. This is not what happens today, but just stick with this for now. I'm gonna show you a graphic to make you understand how this works. So yeah, this triad, all right? Remember, legislative, executive, and finally the judicial power, the three major powers of any state. This graphic helps you to remember how this absolute monarchy works. Basically he had absolute control of the administration, the social groups, including nobility. Really important because it was the source of sharing power during the feudal period, sharing with the nobility, and the church. So those privileged groups, during the authoritarian and the feudal monarchies, they got major powers, and they were sharing power with the king. They were going to be subjugated, controlled by this absolute monarchy. Then, army and taxes, two pillars of the executive power of the king. Among taxes and army, other side powers, like as I said, controlling the police, enforcing diplomacy, declaring war, or signing peace treaties was another attribution that the king got without sharing it with other social groups or individuals. All right, the justification, just stick with it because we are gonna learn about it in a bit. All right, this is a way to make you understand how the system is completely different from our systems. So this will be how our country nowadays is organized. All right, and this is how the absolute monarchies of the 17th centuries were organized. As you can see here, the main difference is a political concept that we know as division of power. So the king during the absolute monarchies, he got the three major powers in his name, alright? And over him was just God. This is the major justification. So God wants you to have absolute power and to be king. So basically, criticizing the king, opposing the king, it was the same as opposing to God or criticizing God in the 17th centuries. Hopefully, nowadays the majority of the democratic countries, they do not follow this system, but the system is close to this one because we implemented something we know as the division of power. The basics are pretty straightforward. It is said that those three powers, they shouldn't be concentrated to avoid corruption and abuse of power. They are not going to be concentrated on the same individual organization. In our system, the parliament got the legislative power. It means that the parliament has the ability to create, abolish, and pass laws. Then the government, it's got the executive power. Obviously, those two are created by direct voting. It means that all the population, well, excluding the underage population and or the population without the ability of voting, obviously, but the citizens, they enforce this the creation and the distribution of the government and the parliament by voting. So parliament and government, they got different kind of powers, and they must share power between them. Finally, the justice courts, they got the judicial power. This is pretty different. They are chosen by state exams. The deal is that the justice have to be separated. It's mandatory. And careful here, because the justice, in some cases, here in Spain we got several of those cases, a lot of them actually. The justice courts could enforce justice on the parliament and the government, or just parts of them. If they 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 got some abuses of power, or if they are corrupt or whatever. So the justice courts are pretty essential in our system. Finally, just to know him, one of the clearest or examples of absolute power, Louis XIV, King of France. It's the perfect example of how an absolute monarchy is in the 17th centuries. All right, those monarchies were based in some pillars, some foundations. They were a way of justifying justifying why just one person have to or must have absolute power. In our countries, will be difficult to justify, even though we know plenty of countries which are living in dictatorships. But as a blessing, we're not living in one. So for us, it's pretty shocking that just one person accumulates all the power. Those were the justifications that, well, they were pretty wise to justify the power of the king with those pillars at the time. Today, it shouldn't work out in our countries, at least with countries with free press and individual rights. The first is the divine right. This pillar means that basically the god ceded the power to the king. In other words, the king is the god's chosen. So the king is only accountable not to the judicial power, but just to God. So this is the basis of the absolute monarchies. It's pretty tough to criticize the monarchy if it is said that God decides to choose the king as his representative. So yeah, it was a pretty obvious but wise way of strengthening the power of the king by saying that he was chosen by God. Then the state interest. This idea is more complex than I am explaining here. It is based on an on the theory of the social contract, first created by Hobbes and then developed by other intellectuals. But basically, it is said that the people is ceding his individual rights, his right to vote and to choose to the king, because the king is gonna guarantee the best interest from the people of the kingdom, obviously. So it's in on the best interest of the people to rely blindly on the power of the king. As I said, a justification. This was not true, not definitely on the 16th, 17th centuries. The interest of the people of the not citizens yet, but just the people of France, for example, I am afraid it was not in the best interest of the king. And then we got a centralized administration. This last one is not a justification, but a pretty useful tool. The king is gonna start being supported by some civil servants, some bureaucrats, and they are gonna try to administrate the kingdom for him in his names, in his name. Obviously, the king he's gonna choose members of the bourgeoisie rather than nobility and clergy, even though he had to do that because he could not ostracize the nobility just because he wanted to. By enforcing those civil servants, like for example police chiefs, um, so yeah, he's trying to make sure all his orders and power he's gonna be projected properly, and by employing those bureaucrats, those civil servants, like as I said, as a police chief or a tax collector, he's ensuring that the executive power is gonna be enforced properly. So divine right, this state interest, and finally the use of civil servants, bureaucrats, to create a centralized administration. This is a text I'm just showing you from Bossuet, which is how the divine right works. So this is a literal text that I'm here showing to make you understand how the divine right works. I'm gonna read it. So, Dios estableció a los reyes como sus ministros y la reina a través de ellos sobre los pueblos. Los príncipes actúan como los ministros de Dios y sus lugartenientes en la tierra. Fijaros aquí, ¿no? Sus lugartenientes en la tierra. Por medio de ellos ejercita su imperio. Por ello el trono real no es el trono de un hombre, sino el de Dios mismo. Se desprende de todo ello que la persona del rey es sagrada y atentar contra ella es un sacrilegio. Alright, pretty straightforward, right? This identification, this comparison as opposing the king as opposing the god. So the idea is that through this political theory, nobody's gonna dare just opposing to the king, because it was to oppose against religion, and this was a pretty horrible crime to do. Let's go to the parliamentary monarchies. So those are pretty uncommon compared with the absolute system. So in Europe, the majority of the political systems of the country, they are going to follow an absolute monarchy, or they will be stuck on a feudal one, as it will happen with Eastern Europe, for example. But in some places, like for example, United Provinces, England, Venice, they will start an uncommon, weird political system called the parliamentary monarchy or republic. So The deal of the parliamentary systems is that the king or another high authority uh, must share power with a parliament of citizens. Obviously, the system was not supported by the king. The king is not going to be happy about sharing the power with another institution and another individuals. But in those places we are gonna learn about, the king was forced by ability and citizens to share power with them. So we are gonna analyze two countries that they got similar political systems. We are gonna avoid others, like for example Venice. So we are gonna stick with those two. Those two countries are the United Provinces and then England. Let's start with the United Provinces. So the United Provinces acquired independence from the Hispanic monarchy, as you already know. They will become independent in the practical way at the end of the 16th century, but with the signature of the Treaty of Westphalia, the Hispanic monarchy will recognize the United Provinces as independent. So they created a republican system. It means that the highest authority is going to be elected by part of the population, and they will divide the system into 7 provinces. Those provinces, they got each one of those a parliament. All right, so this is a picture showing the 7 provinces and some other territories conquered and bought in the southern areas. The idea was that each one of those all those provinces, they got a parliament, and then the whole country will be managed by those parliaments sending representatives, and thus those representatives will start deciding about the country and attending meetings and sharing power with the highest authority of the United Provinces. Pretty uncommon system. The English system will be similar as an absolute monarchy, but obviously the king had to share power with the parliament. As we said, England is gonna try the system with the king and not without it. It means that the highest authority, which was the king, was not elected as it was in the United Provinces. But even though the king had his share of power pretty limited. The different king of Englands during the modern age, they all will try to fight the nobility and the English citizens for acquiring the absolute monarchy system. But the thing is that the kings are not going to be capable of enforcing his authority as they will be in France or in the Hispanic monarchy. So in the 17th centuries, there is two revolutions that will result first in the death of Charles I and then the abdication of James II. You got here 1640 and 1688. So the king, he was trying to enforce his authority to implement an absolute monarchy system, but the nobility and some citizen some social groups they are not gonna let the king to do that, and they will rebel, killing and forcing the second king to abdicate, to forget about the crown. Finally, after those two revolutions, William III will be elected as the new king. It was a nobility family from the Dutch territories, so they will bring a foreign king. It was not uncommon. Just think that Carlos I was also a foreign king from the from the Burgundian crown. Well, William III will be crowned as king, but he will have to sign something that we call as the Bill of Rights, signed in 1689. The Bill of Rights establishes several points that they will limit the power of the king. First, the king will need the parliament, so it is mandatory for him to speak with the parliament, to convince the parliament, all right, and the parliament has the last word in passing any laws, levying taxes, or creating any armies in times of peace. Alright? So as you can see here, the legislative power was completely conditioned by the parliament as levying taxes or armies, one of the two most important attributions of the executive power. Then the parliament is going to be divided into two organisms or two houses. The houses of lords, they were composed of nobles, nobility, and clergy, and the commons, they are commoners. The clergy were pretty uncommon, typically they were nobles, and the commons that they will create by or formed by commoners. The House of Lords was a position that the lords will inherit as the title. So, for example, the Duke of Buckingham. Let's give an example of the Suffolk. He will have the right to attending to this parliament, and then when the title will be inherited by his heir will be entitled to coming to the parliament. With the commons or the commoners was different. Those were chosen in city voting systems. Finally, the Bill of Rights will establish religious tolerance from non-Anglicans. Just remember that in England and Ireland and Scotland, there were pretty important groups formed of Catholics and Calvinists. So to avoid religious conflict, this religious tolerance was created. As I said, they were not accepted. The religious minorities were not accepted. They will just be tolerated. As always, the Anglicans will be the majority and the most powerful groups. Here you got a picture of the execution of Charles I in 1640s. As you can imagine, it was a pretty shocking event, even for the 17th centuries, right? 1640s, the execution of Charles I. And then here just a reminder of how a parliamentary monarchy works. So the king has to share power with the parliament. The king has some executive attributions, but with any laws, politics, diplomacy, war, taxes, he requires the parliament to pass any taxes, to pass any laws, to approve the creation of an army in times of peace. So king of parliament and parliament, they are sharing power. Alright, this is a really different system from an absolute monarchy. Alright, some couple of activities from page 61.2 and 61.3.4. You have to send those activities to me, as well as the bullets of today's lesson. Alright, see you next video.